The day you stopped defending it, that was the day the stone rolled shut. There's a specific kind of silence that settles into a person who once carried a God-given dream and quietly decided to stop talking about it. Not because it died, but because the room went cold every time you mentioned it. Because the people who should have prayed with you looked at you like you'd said something embarrassing. Because the voice came maybe from someone you trusted, maybe from someone you didn't even respect, and it said, "That's not going to happen." And somewhere between that sentence and your heart, something began to move, something heavy, something final. What you're about to understand is not a comfort message. This is not a stay encouraged prayer point. This is a precise, surgical truth about why some God-given visions appear to die, and why the prayer that revives dead dreams sounds nothing like the prayer most people are still praying over them. Stay with this, because what God placed in you before the world had a chance to discourage you, it never received a death certificate. Here's the quiet danger you may not have put words to yet. The longer a God-given vision sits buried, the more its silence begins to function as evidence against itself. The mind, designed for resolution, allergic to open loops, starts to reinterpret the stillness. Maybe it wasn't really God, maybe I was projecting, maybe I mistook ambition for calling. Every year without movement becomes another stone added to the entrance. And if that reinterpretation process has been happening inside you, it means the burial is still active, not in the past, right now. You know the account of Lazarus. Most people do, but here is what most people skip past in their rush toward the miracle. When Jesus finally arrives at Bethany, Lazarus has been in the tomb for 4 days, and Martha runs to meet him and says, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died." That sentence, memorize it. Because that is the exact sentence living inside every person who has watched a God-given calling go silent under the weight of the wrong voices. If you had been here, if you had spoken sooner, if I had heard your voice before that person got to me, it wouldn't have gotten this far. It is the theology of almost, and it is the posture that keeps the stone in place. Let's be precise about how dead dreams get buried, because it doesn't happen in a single moment, it happens in layers. The first layer is discouragement. Someone speaks doubt over the vision. A parent, a pastor, a mentor who had long ago made peace with their own abandoned calling and unconsciously expected you to follow. The word lands, the dream is still alive, you just stop voicing it out loud. The second layer is God's silence. You pray, you wait, nothing moves, and in that silence the words of discouragement begin to fill the space. This is where most believers make a fatal interpretive error. They read God's silence as God's agreement with the critics. The third layer is internalization. This is where the critical voice stops being someone else's voice and becomes your own inner narrator. When you no longer need anyone to say, "Who do you think you are?" because you are already saying it to yourself every single time the dream surfaces. This is the stage where a delayed dream becomes a buried calling, and buried things don't simply disappear, they decompose. And decomposing callings produce one very specific kind of spiritual toxin, the belief that being realistic is the same thing as being faithful. Here is the moment in John 11 that almost no one preaches. Jesus arrives at the tomb. He already knows what he is about to do. He has the authority. He has the will. And then the text collapses into 2 words that have stood inside every grieving believer for 2,000 years. Jesus wept. Not because he had lost hope, not because the situation had outrun his power. He wept because he saw what the loss had done to the people standing around that tomb. He saw the grief that had accumulated in 4 days of silence and stone. He saw what waiting without understanding costs a person's faith. And this is what needs to rewire something inside you right now. The God who is about to resurrect what you buried, he already wept over what the burying cost you. He is not distant from the damage. He stood at the entrance of what hurt you, and he was moved. That is not a theological footnote. That is the heart of God on record. He sees the dead dream. He sees the voices that drove it underground, and he is not indifferent to what that silence has done to your intercession. But now the story gets ruthlessly honest. When Jesus says, "Roll away the stone," Martha objects. "Lord, by this time he stinketh, for he hath been dead 4 days." She's not being faithless, she's being protective. She has already done the grief work. She has accepted the loss. She moved into managing the aftermath, and the last thing she wants is to crack open something that will only confirm the hope was foolish. This is the most dangerous spiritual posture that exists in the life of someone carrying a buried God-given vision. It is not unbelief, it is not rebellion. It is the person who has made peace with the tomb to avoid the possibility of being disappointed at the entrance. They don't pray for the dead dream anymore. They pray around it. They build careful theology to explain why the burial was actually God's sovereignty at work. They become sophisticated grief managers who mistake their own resignation for spiritual maturity. If that is you, if you have built articulate, composed theology around why the thing God placed in you probably wasn't meant to survive, then what comes next is going to recontextualize everything. Because Jesus didn't argue with Martha about the smell. He simply said, "Did I not tell you that if you believed, you would see the glory of God?" Not, "Did you deserve the miracle?" Not, "Have you been waiting long enough?" Not, "Can you prove the vision was really from God before I act?" He anchored the entire event to one variable: will you believe? Here is the prayer that revives dead dreams, and why it sounds nothing like what most people are praying. Most people approach a buried calling in one of two ways. The first is begging, desperate, repetitive petition that unconsciously communicates disbelief. Every time you pray the same prayer with the same defeated posture, you are agreeing with the stone. You are praying from inside the grief rather than from outside the tomb. The second is bargaining. "God, if this was really from you, give me a sign," which is another way of saying, "I need evidence before I can believe again," which is another way of saying Martha's sentence. Neither of those postures rolls away the stone. The prayer that resurrects a God-given calling does something fundamentally different. It shifts from petition to intercession, from asking God to do something he hasn't done yet to standing in agreement with what God already declared over the vision before the critical voices had access to it. This is what biblical intercession for dead dreams actually looks like. You're not informing God of a problem. You are aligning your voice with what his voice already spoke, and you are speaking it directly at the tomb. Ezekiel stood in a valley of dry bones and prophesied to them. He didn't ask God whether the bones could live. He asked the bones to receive what God had already declared, and then he opened his mouth, and he spoke, and the bones came together. When you move from begging to intercession, from hoping the dream might still be alive to commanding what God placed in you to come forth, something in the atmosphere of your prayer life shifts. The language changes, the posture changes. You stop praying, "God, please don't let this be over." You start praying, "Father, the vision you gave me was not invalidated by the voices that buried it. I am standing at this tomb. I am rolling away the stone, and I am calling what you declared over my life to come forth." That is not arrogance, that is faith exercising authority, and it is terrifying, because it requires you to believe before you see, which is precisely what the stone was protecting you from. There is one more thing about Lazarus that needs to be said. When he walked out of that tomb, the text says he came out bound hand and foot with grave clothes, still wrapped, still carrying the smell of where he had been. Some of what God is about to resurrect in you is going to come out still wearing the evidence of the burial. The God-given dream may return wounded, slower than you once imagined, carrying the marks of the years it spent in silence. That is not a sign that the resurrection was incomplete. That is a sign that Lazarus just walked out of the tomb, and the unraveling happens next. The God who called him forth did not leave him in the grave clothes. He turned to the people standing there and said, "Loose him, let him go." The same God who calls your calling forward will oversee its unraveling. But first, you have to roll away the stone.